Hello. Hello. Welcome to our Headstrong live stream. Welcome back if you've been here before. Welcome if you're live with us right now. And welcome if you're watching back at any time, anywhere else in the world. It's just great to have you here. Welcome to our live stream that we've called What is Loss and How Can We Look After Ourselves? We're going to think a little bit about loss and grief tonight. And just a quick hello from our other guests tonight as well.
Hi.
That's great. It's great to have you here. Sorry, guys. Go for it.
Right. Thanks for having us. We're thrilled to be along.
Yeah. So welcome back if you've been before. Like I said, it's just great to have you here. And just to begin to think about maybe a different topic, we've been thinking a lot about emotions across some of these live streams, in case you've noticed that trend. And loss and grief, that might bring up some complex, difficult emotions. It might feel like complex, difficult emotions for us. So we felt like it was such an important topic. But we felt that weren't able to just talk about that alone. And we really wanted other people to help us. So tonight we've invited some guests along who can just really bring some good insight and ideas and experience to that conversation. And we're really excited to have this conversation together. And I hope you guys are too.
Absolutely.
Amazing. I'm so glad. So who are we? We should probably start by introducing ourselves. So hello, I'm Robson. And I am part of the Headstrong team, and I'm the manager for the Illumina project. So it sits inside Headstrong. But what is Headstrong, in case you've not been here before? Well, Headstrong is an online social media kind of platform space that's for mental and emotional well-being for young people. And we try and equip young people with kind of ideas and understanding about these topics, just to help them maybe look after themselves and help you maybe find the resources or people that you need. So that's who we are. I am Robson, like I said, and I am the manager of Illumina within that. And Illumina is an online support space and group that work around kind of self-harm and struggles with self-harm, with the goal of trying to figure out what recovery actually looks like and what maybe a life without self-harm would look like. So we do work, as you can see, at selfharm.co.uk, and you can find out more about that specific thing there. But that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. Here we're here to talk about maybe some bigger things in the Headstrong conversations. So first, over to you guys to introduce yourselves.
Thank you. So we are from a company called Me and My Therapy, which is a community interest company. We were friends before we set up Me and My Therapy together. So we have a vast amount of experience in supporting families, individuals, young people, children and adults when dealing with grief and loss. So my name is Callie.
And I'm Sarah.
And we're thrilled to be with you tonight and thinking about this important topic and how the topic of grief and loss does contribute to the wider conversation on emotions and well-being. And so hopefully we can give you a little bit of information about that and also some tips on how to deal with that situation too.
Amazing. And you guys also bring like a lot of experience with you, don't you? Do you want to tell us quickly a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, so we've worked in the field of bereavement for many years, both of us in various jobs together and separately as well. And as Callie said before, working in the field of grief and loss with children, young people, adults and families as well, and also supporting those professionals that are supporting the children, young people and adults as well. It's really important that we look at this holistically, so that people are equipped and are informed of how best to manage this. Very sadly, grief and loss is something that we all face at some point in our life. So we're really passionate about empowering people, upskilling people and just giving confidence to those people, whether those are the bereaved themselves or professionals supporting, just so that we feel as equipped as possible to manage these really difficult, challenging situations.
And I think that young people yourselves, you might not need an expert like Sarah or I. You might need someone who you're already close to in your life just to understand your grief a bit more. And you might need to understand your own a bit more too. We are all, as it says, we have our own experiences of loss and bereavement. We have our own ways of responding. So to have a bit of an understanding of why we respond the way we do or how we could respond better will equip you for your future, and how you can support friends, and into adulthood, how you can support people. Because sadly, grief and loss is something we will all come across numerous times in our lives. And it's something we're passionate about having as an open conversation, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And being mindful as well that we've spoken about the word loss there on a couple of occasions, and just being really mindful that loss comes in lots of forms, not always just in relation to that of the death of someone. And I think tonight we're very much focusing on the grief idea around bereavement in particular, but just being mindful that loss can come in lots of forms and can still be really, really tricky in those forms as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and as you guys have touched on so well there, and as we just want to emphasize on this, just on this slide here, we do all have our own experiences of loss and bereavement and of grief, or just those, like Sarah said, the things that might bring up those feelings or experiences for us. And so we want to be mindful of that tonight. If when you're watching this session right now, or maybe at a future time, and actually it just becomes too much, or you maybe need to take a break, we want to be mindful that that could be a big topic for us sometimes. And we want to be in the right place and the right headspace to kind of start to think about that. And so if you do need to take time for yourself, you definitely should. And we'd really encourage that. And if you do need to pause or come back at a different time, or reach out to someone to make sure that we've just got the support we need in that moment, we should definitely do that as well. Because we do all have our own experience, and that will completely shape how much we engage with this space and these slides tonight. Yeah, thank you. So we've been saying these words of grief and loss and bereavement, and like a lot of different words for maybe similar things, or things that people might think are the same thing. So I guess the first question we really want to try and understand, and as you've already touched on so well, like what are they, and what might grief and loss actually feel like? Guys, do you have anything you'd give us as like the experts here in the moment?
I think I was just about, I know we both kind of feel really passionate about this side of things, don't we? I think we can sometimes think that grief and loss and bereavement all mean the same thing, because we do hear those words and phrases usually in the same context, but they are all really different. And grief, as we all know, and Robson, you've just touched on, it's so individual. This is so unique. This isn't a one size fits all. I very often think it would be a lot easier if it was the case and there was a really good little textbook to follow for those that are grieving, but it doesn't work like that. And grief is the human, it's the physical, emotional response to a loss. And that's why it's so individual. So grief is very different to that concept of loss in that in that we don't all grieve in the same way. It looks and feels very different for everyone, and there is no right or wrong way to do it. So I think it's really important that when we're thinking about these phrases, we normalise that as well.
I think so often when we speak to children, young people and adults who are grieving, it can often feel like you're the only one going through it. And I think because of the nature of grief, because it is so individual, we tend to keep it to ourselves sometimes, even within families where they're grieving the death of the same person. They might all be doing that quite differently. They might also all be trying to protect each other within that. So it becomes, and generally in our society, is something that is quite hidden. It's quite taboo to talk about and think about, which makes it quite a lonely place to be. And you've got some headings there around sort of our bodies, our minds, our emotions, our responses. And I think it's really important to recognise that it is in all of those areas that grief impacts us. It's not just a simple feeling that we wake up with and go to sleep with. It's something that we carry with us.
Absolutely. I think for me, I noticed that it can bring up so many other feelings or emotions as well, can't it? Like we can begin to feel low mood or sad or maybe quite frustrated and angry, and actually it can bring up so many other complex feelings, can't it?
Yeah. And I think with that, those emotions, it's that permission to feel any of them, on all of them at any one time. And what we would say with that as well, and what we say so often, is guilt and regret play a huge part there. And also the sense of happiness and excitement there's a feeling of guilt around experiencing those feelings too. There's a feeling that if I'm grieving, I can't possibly be happy or excited about anything. And I guess we're here to say that absolutely you can. In fact, you should. And in terms of being worried about your own grief and worried about your responses, if you are struggling to feel any sense of joy or any sense of happiness and excitement, or allowing yourself to, that's when we'd be more concerned, to be honest. So it's normal to feel guilty for feeling them, but it's normal to feel them too, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think that really hits home just maybe the complexity that it can bring sometimes. It really can bring maybe contradictions like that, where it's both normal to feel it and to not, or normal to feel the positive and to feel negative about the positive. Yeah. Thank you for that. And I really just think that the big thing that I'd like to hit home here is that final point, that it is okay to feel these ways. And as you guys have already said, like it's something that might happen. It's something that will happen. We will feel these feelings at different times in our lives. And it is completely normal that these feelings might come, and they might bring other difficult feelings. Like it is okay that we might feel these things. Do you guys have anything you'd like to add there?
I think I just want to add around, you've made a point there around the bodies as well. And I think it's something that we can easily forget, that grief can have an impact on our physical well-being as much as our emotional. I think so often, we hear of young people complaining of headaches, stomach aches, sort of anxiety-like behaviours, anxiety-like symptoms that are physiological. You're feeling them in your body. And we don't make that link to the bereavement, but our bodies are really good at telling us if something's wrong, especially if we're ignoring the messages our mind's giving. If we're not able to engage with the messages our mind's giving, if it's too painful to go there, our body will find a way of telling us.
Yeah. So again, that's about giving yourself permission to feel, and really normalizing some of those feelings as well. Like we've said, it's normal to feel these things. These are really common grief responses. Giving yourself permission to feel them. Equally, gaining some acceptance around a feeling of numbness as well. We've spoken a lot around some of the presenting feelings and emotions that may be there, but actually sometimes people just describe themselves as feeling really numb. They can't really tap into any feelings, and again, really normal. It's okay. It's difficult to feel like that, of course, but it's okay to feel that. So really giving yourself permission to feel whatever you feel.
Or not.
Or not feel. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Absolutely. Yeah. And so as we've kind of mentioned already, these ideas of endings, of grief, of loss, they might come in different ways. We might experience them in different places. And Sarah, you hit on something just at the start there about how sometimes they might not come in the form of grief or bereavement at all. And we really wanted to highlight that in this space because, noticing the time of year we're doing this recording, we're at the time where schools are transitioning, and actually that can bring up some of these feelings. So do you guys want to maybe speak on that a little bit? I loved the stuff you already said about it.
I think transition is a huge one, isn't it, that we see an awful lot, and what that very often is it's the loss of that classroom, that college space, that uni space, the loss of your teachers, lecturers, peer groups. There's lots of change that comes with that transition, so it's really important to be mindful that loss, we're not just relating here just to that of the death of someone. Another really big significant loss that we see an awful lot is the breakdown of a relationship, and that loss of it, be it a partner or a friendship, and thinking about parents, thinking around divorce and all different kind of relational loss there. We can't underestimate the impact.
No, and I think so often, so many of those losses we're talking about there, they can have secondary losses as well, what we'd call them. So because of a situation, you may find yourself losing other things. So an example like you've touched on there is that transition period. A transition from one school to a next could result in a loss of friendships. A transition within a relationship, so a breakdown of a parent's marriage or relationship, could mean a loss of a family home. it certainly means a loss of a routine or a life that you would have become accustomed to. So I guess when we're talking about the feelings of grieving, of the emotional impact here and the physical impact, if you're sat there thinking, well, nobody's died, but I feel exactly like that, that's okay. And in some ways, we talk about the death of someone being a little bit more straightforward in that respect, because it's final. There is an ending there that cannot be undone, as painful as that is. When it's a loss, then it's something a little bit more complicated than that, whether it be a relationship or a situation or a transition. That can be really difficult, because you know that person, that thing, that situation is still existing without you. And that's even harder to get your head around sometimes.
Yeah, I'm really just thinking about this idea of control there, and just like how much we maybe feel that we've lost control in all of those situations. But actually, the point you make, that if the people are still around or the life is still continuing maybe without us, that can really feel like we lose control, can't it?
Control is a huge thing, isn't it? We talk about so often we find young people have that control taken away from them in these situations too. So people deciding maybe what they think is best for them at a time when they feel so out of control, and that can really exacerbate those feelings of loneliness again.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, so we've thought a bit about maybe like where these feelings come from, like what they are, like what do they physically feel like for us? Is that okay? And the next thing we really wanted to understand, just to help us, whether you're watching this because you're trying to get your head around these feelings yourselves, or because you're trying to support someone, like just to help us think, well, what's going on? Why do we feel this way? Like, what is actually going on in that situation when we lose someone, when there's a transition that feels like an ending? Why does it bring these feelings? And so there's a few ideas there on the slide. But I wonder if you guys have any thoughts around just what happens when we maybe are focusing on what life was like before. What happens when we're thinking about that past?
I think very often there's a real need to think about what life was like before. There's a real need to consider the change that has come about. It's all part of the processing of that loss, and in that we talk a lot about the continuing bonds that we may have with a person and all the memory work that we may do. There's a real need to reflect. However, that is, of course, very often really, really difficult to do, and that links into some of the guilt and regret that you mentioned earlier, that can very often present when we're reflecting on what life was like before. Very often we may see some people that actually find that too difficult to think about what life was like before. And equally, lots of people may feel that actually it's too difficult to consider what life is going to be like now. So again, really normalizing that. And it's about, if you feel like you're in a space whereby you can't think about the past with ease, that's too difficult. And it's also too difficult to think and comprehend what a future may look like, that actually what we need to focus on is where we are right now, and that's okay. So let's build and really kind of build on that resilience in terms of where we're at now. And then it may be when we move through that a little bit, with hopefully the support of peers and whoever you reach out to for support, that we may then reach a stage whereby reflecting becomes a little bit easier and focusing on the future becomes a little bit more manageable as well.
Yeah, I think that feeling of thinking about what the future might look like, I think we hear so often in the immediate aftermath of a death or an ending. People can go sort of 10,000 miles an hour ahead and start thinking of this future, and it is quite scary. You can feel quite fearful about what that might look like. So some tips on being in that moment, being in the present, and maybe sticking with what that feels like right now is okay. And as time progresses, you find a way to look at what life was like before in a much more comfortable way. And you also find a way to see the future in a much more comfortable way. I think that third point is something we really need to pick up on, because I can't tell you how many times a young person has come to me and felt that it might be their fault that someone has died, or that there has been this ending, or that, you know, the relationship has ended because of them, even if it's not their relationship. And some of the reasons that young people come up with, as an outsider, you might look and think, well, you know, how on earth have they managed to believe that this is their fault? But when you're with them in that moment, that feeling is so real, that feeling of fault and responsibility, and that magic phrase of if I could have, if I did this. We can spend a long time in that feeling.
Yeah, and it can become really consuming as well, so much so that becomes the feeling that the focus comes to, as opposed to actually that real sense of loss. And that sense of guilt can be really consuming. And again, I think the importance of talking about that when and if you feel comfortable to, really expressing that actually this is really what I'm struggling with, and almost reasoning that in your own mind. We'll work with young people that tend to start out with a real strong feeling of guilt, but then after some time of processing and really exploring what is going on and what has gone on, more often than not, we do see some movement on that, and see that in time, and when that understanding is there and the clarity actually is there, when that numbness has faded and that overwhelm in all the feelings have faded, we do very often see that actually there is some sense to be made of, actually this wasn't my fault, or there was nothing I could have done, actually.
It's just some real value in saying it out loud sometimes. I think when people do say it out loud and own that, they almost rehear it and check in with themselves and think, oh, actually maybe that doesn't make sense, maybe it isn't my fault. But the carrying that guilt and that feeling for so long is painful. It's a painful emotion.
Absolutely. Yeah, and so, you know, on that, if that's something that we're thinking or feeling as we come into this space, and as we're in this live stream, like, we want to say that we understand where that comes from. Like Callie and Sarah have said, like, that's something that was amazing just to reflect on and maybe speak to someone about, and then actually we can really begin to work through that. So many of the points you guys just made there really just helped me think that a lot of that, where that feeling comes from, might be that we feel quite stuck in it. We can't think about the past, and we're struggling to think about the future, and we're struggling and maybe reflecting on it a lot and ruminating and having those thoughts of, was I to blame? Was I involved? And we can feel kind of stuck in all of that, can't we?
Yeah, and very isolated in that as well. You know, that can be a really lonely place to be. I think an important point to make as well, just coming back a little bit to some of the ideas around transition that we spoke about before. If you are bereaved of a person, you know, if you're grieving the loss of a loved one, and then you are facing another ending, be it via transition or a relationship breakdown, or a hobby that you've done for years that actually is now coming to a natural end, what we can sometimes say is that when another ending is about to come, that can really bring up historical feelings of grief to the surface, because we're faced with another potential loss, we're embarking on another ending. So it's really worth being mindful and being kind to yourself in that as well, and gaining a little bit of understanding. You know, why am I finding this so difficult? What is this that's so difficult? It's not, I guess, on paper a huge thing, but actually, if we just take a minute to think, okay, this is another ending. Of course, I'm going to find this difficult because of my past experiences of an ending and of a loss. Things become a little bit clearer when we understand why. So it's, again, and we can get that clarity by, as you said, Callie, just taking a minute, verbalising these things, saying things out loud, and almost hearing them back can be useful.
Yeah, I think that opportunity to share with someone and find that someone, first of all, who it feels safe to share with, is invaluable, really. You know, we work with people where in their families, as I mentioned before, they may not share it between them, but if you can imagine siblings, for example, sharing their feelings and realizing that they're both carrying this responsibility, this fault, and neither of them knew they were carrying it, and it was a completely different reason. that's so freeing to hear it, and maybe hear it from someone else in your family and think, oh gosh, you thought that was you, or I thought that was me. And saying it out loud is just giving that opportunity then to say, okay, well, actually that was the feelings talking. That's not the reality of this. So I think finding that safe person to speak to offload to, whether that be in the real world or even in the virtual world, finding someone who can hear that. It might be for you that being someone who knows you is too uncomfortable, so finding sort of a helpline or finding someone as an external person who can hear that feels much more comfortable, and that could be okay as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. So, we've already kind of touched on two big answers to this question here. We've already said that this idea of being kind to yourself is huge, especially when some of these feelings come up, or some of these difficult thoughts related to it come up. And maybe that's something we struggle with, but it's definitely something we're all suggesting here. And then secondly, that idea of finding that person, or that safe person we can speak to about it, whether it's online, or a helpline, or a peer, like a sibling or a friend, or whether it's a professional or an adult in our lives. But what else can we do? Like, how else can we respond to these feelings? What else can we do when we experience loss or grief or endings? How else can we do it? I know you guys had some great tips that you wanted to share with us. So why don't you give us an insight into some more things we can do to respond to it?
I think when you talked about people again then, and we said about finding a safe person, I think sometimes that is too far away to think about. And so something you may do first would maybe be to write that down. Maybe your safe person isn't a person at all to begin with. Journaling, even if it's bullet points, even if you're directing that journaling to the person who's died, that can be a really helpful way of putting those feelings somewhere. For some people, it's the words aren't going to come easily. Words aren't their way of communicating. So, using creative means, whether that be music, whether that be art, to express where you're at, can be a really therapeutic way of processing that grief. It's never as straightforward as just, okay, now we're going to do the grief work. It kind of comes out in lots of different ways too.
And I think for lots of people, not just children and young people, lots of people generally, actually sitting across a table from someone or across a Zoom screen from someone and having that real requirement for eye contact while sharing your deepest thoughts and fears very often is just too difficult. So having that notebook, having that text option instead, having, as Callie said, those art resources that, do you know what, I've got all these feelings at the minute, I just need to put them somewhere and just let go. It doesn't miraculously fix it. It doesn't miraculously rescue. But what it does do, it allows you to heal a little bit in that moment, and you're releasing what you've got. We work with lots of people that use artwork and drawing as a means of processing their grief. And what we tend to find is, even if you are alongside somebody because you actually need that person with you, but finding the words is too difficult, if you're engaged in something, even if it's just doodling or creating a piece of artwork, that requirement for eye contact isn't there because you're engaged in something. So the person's there, and the words may start to flow because your brain is engaged in creating something. And very often, sometimes doing those things is quite useful to do at night before sleep. Not for everyone, but again, just hints and tips. Some things work for some people, some things work for others. But some people do feel that putting their thoughts on paper, literally, before sleeping is quite helpful for a restful sleep. They're not holding on to those difficult feelings and then trying to get to sleep and struggling with that. That can work for some people.
It can. And I think feelings is the starting point, really. In any work that we do with children and young people who are grieving, it's around identifying those feelings first, and then thinking about how we respond. So it might be as simple as noticing your feelings and noticing how you're responding at the moment and thinking, is there a way that I could respond better to this? But also recognizing what you're doing well within that. So knowing that if when you feel angry, this is what you do, and checking in with yourself, like, does that feel okay? Does that feel like the right response right now? Actually, yeah, it does. So I'm going to keep doing that one. But finding the ones that feel uncomfortable as well. So maybe if by feeling upset you take yourself away and isolate yourself, but that then makes that feeling worse, then maybe thinking about, okay, when I'm upset, what could I do instead of taking myself away? What would give me that safety? And it might be, as Sarah said, just being alongside someone and not talking, but knowing that that's okay as well, not having that expectation. I think many of you might think about this as I say it, but and think of a time when it's happened, but I certainly know parents talk to us about, you know, the conversations that happen in the car when you're driving, and a child, young person feels that that is a safe time to actually talk about something. It's in a safe, contained area. You're not in the home. It doesn't have to come in the door with you. And it might be a time when as a young person, you think, okay, I'm going to say it now. And you have permission to say, yeah, I'm going to tell you something now, but I don't want to talk about it when I get home. Permission and honesty is the biggest thing that we can advocate for in this. So if all you take from today is that you have permission to say what you need from people, then that would be enough, really.
Yeah, totally.
I love that. That's amazing. And so you guys have made this great point when we were chatting about tonight's session of just this idea of growing around our grief and how we can kind of begin to actually recognize that we're not trying to get rid of anything, but actually we're just trying to keep that as part of us or keep that inside of us while also allowing ourselves to grow. And that kind of goes back to some of the things of guilt that we've mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
But yeah, do you want to help us understand this model a little bit more?
Yeah,
absolutely. I think when we talk about theory, we're really keen that, you know, theories aren't just made so that they can stay in textbooks. Like this theory, it's not ours. It's a researcher called Tonkin, made it in the 90s, but made it in collaboration with grieving people. So this really spoke to us. And the idea being that you might have heard it yourselves, people saying things like time's a healer, you know, it'll get better, but also saying really unhelpful things like, oh, you know, it's been ages now, you're not over this, or oh, that was last year, like I thought you'd be okay by now. Actually, time, you know, it doesn't really have much impact, and those sayings can be really unhelpful to people.
They're quite pressurized, aren't they? If you had said to someone, oh, you know, it's been 6 months now, you know, that person immediately not only feels most probably really quite hurt and offended by that, but also feels a real sense of pressure. Or should I still be feeling this? Should I be in a different headspace now? It's quite pressurized. Any kind of talk around time.
Scale. Yeah. And particularly when you're a young person, you know, we were just in the school this afternoon and we were reminding teachers that when they talk about last year in September, what they actually mean is about 3 months ago. So when things have happened last year, they might be so fresh to you. So time is really important. And this sort of image, what we've shared there is that ball of grief, so that black ball being that feeling of grief, what people tend to believe is that shrinks over time. But the people involved in this research in this study said that, well, that's not true at all. And actually, we wouldn't want it to be true. Because you may have heard that grief is love. You know, people use that phrase quite a lot. Grief is the love that they can't put anywhere else. So to some people, to tell them that their grief is going to shrink is telling them their love's going to shrink. And that messaging can be hurtful too, because it can imply you might forget. It can imply you might not feel the same about the person.
Or your love wasn't that strong in the first place. It can imply... and again, it's unhelpful, isn't it? It's hurtful and unhelpful. And it's absolutely just a note on that to say, these things, if they are said, are usually given with the best of intentions, and always given with the intent to comfort. So we're not for 1 minute saying that if anyone has ever said these things, you know, you've said something wrong. They're always given with the intent to comfort. But actually, if we break it down and really consider what it is we're saying, is that the most helpful thing to say to somebody that's in a really difficult place of grief at the moment? Probably not. So we tend to think of it, I'll let you carry on. We tend to think of it in another way.
So that ball of grief, you know, that is part of your story now. That will stay the same size for the rest of your life. But what actually happens is that you grow around it instead. So maybe in those initial moments, hours, days after a bereavement or a loss, you are all consumed by it. There is not much space around that ball anymore. There might be space to do your normal everyday things. You might even manage to get yourself to school. You might manage to have a laugh, do football. You might manage to go to the cinema, watch a film. But there's not a huge amount of space. There's not a huge amount of time where it's not taking up your whole thoughts. But as time goes on, that space will grow a bit bigger. And what's really helpful when we think about young people is you yourselves will grow, your lives will grow. They'll grow beyond that schoolyard. They'll grow beyond the friendships that you have there. They'll grow into what you nurture and what you want them to be. So thinking about grief as something that's there and consistent, but thinking about when we talked earlier about how difficult the future is, imagining what you'd like to fit in around that grief might be really helpful.
I love that. That's amazing. And so kind of following on from that point perfectly, we have this other idea of just not forgetting, like, you know, that ball staying the same, that grief staying there and being the same. It really does mean that we're not saying at any point we should forget, or we should like no longer remember or memorialize grief that's maybe gone before, or things that we've lost, or people we've lost. But that actually that's such a key thing to hold on to. And instead, we're just going to grow around that, like you just said. And so, you know, the next point we want to hit home with is this idea of remembering and continuing to build up on those bonds, actually. And you guys made a really good point earlier of just that maybe writing a journal or a letter that's to this person that kind of keeps that connection there a little bit, doesn't it? I love this idea.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And again, thinking back to many, many years ago, the idea of continuing bonds and memory work and really owning those memories wasn't really the done thing. It was very much the sort of mindset of, you know, come on, we should be over this by now. And thank goodness, as a society, we have really shifted in that thinking, and we do now feel a lot more comfortable on the whole of sharing our memories of our loved ones, of really celebrating them as well. And we very often say that social media has a huge part to play in that. We see lots of young people that actually find it really difficult to verbalise anything about their grief, their memories of their loved ones. Just talking about their loved ones to someone in person can be really, really difficult, but actually much easier to do a post on social media on that loved one's anniversary or birthday or Mother's Day, Father's Day, etc. And they're really putting their grief somewhere by doing that. They're really owning that. This is my special day. This is my person's special day. And really speaking the name of their loved one as well. So I think ensuring that we do take some time to think of our memories, to build our box of keepsakes. I know keepsakes is there on the slides, that may have our really special photographs in it, or maybe an item of clothing from our loved one, a bottle of their aftershave or perfume, something that really taps into the senses as well, is really important. Again, we're not saying that this is what everyone should do at all. These are just sort of hints and tips that may be useful if you're struggling to know how to feel ultimately.
You'll find that a ritual and a way of memory work that will work for you. So there's loads of different things out there, and you know, some people might make a memory box, some people might have trips to the grave, some people might never go to a grave. People have ashes made into jewelry, people have clothes made into teddies. There's so many ways now that we can remember people and include them in our lives and put them somewhere special. And that's not to say if you don't have any of those things that you're not remembering them, because primarily memories are in our minds, and if that's where for you it's comfortable for them to stay, then that's okay as well. We hear families sharing memories in a lovely way. You know, in your family it might be that person pops up in conversation, and it's a really joyful conversation because they come up at a time and go, oh, remember what they did, or do you remember the time when? And those are ways that we can really practice sort of feeling that and remembering them without the pain with it. We can be nostalgic, we can miss them with every inch of ourselves, but we can also find some joy in those memories. I find.
Yeah, absolutely. And just touching on the area of the visiting the grave that you just mentioned, I think that's a really important thing to pick up on, in that we work with lots of people that actually really have no desire to go to, not necessarily the grave, but their resting place of their loved one, and they feel a real sense of guilt over that very often. You know, so and so says I really should go, or I feel like I really should go, but I really don't want to. And again, give yourself permission for that. You know, if there's something inside of you that's telling you that you're not comfortable in doing that, then don't do it. You know, come back to that idea of the rule book, the textbook. There is no rule book to follow with grief. And if something feels too difficult now, that's okay. Let's stay with that. It might not always feel that way for you. But I think, again, taking away any pressure, because what we do know is when you are grieving, when you are feeling a real sense of loss, the pressure is immense anyway. So adding additional pressure that's very often internalised, not always coming from somebody else, is just not helpful. So there's no one telling you how to do this, and we're certainly not doing that, you know. This is about listening to what you need and really taking some ownership over that as well.
I think just finding that place that works for you. You know, if the grave isn't one that works for you, that's fine. Perhaps being at a certain park reminds you of that person.
Yeah.
Perhaps taking a walk down a certain street reminds you of that person. And perhaps it's just a colour or a smell that's thrown at you every now and then.
Yeah.
It's all okay. You don't have to have these certain routines that you do. And they can also change over the years. They can change. Maybe something that's worked for 10 years no longer serves you, and that's okay. There might be a different way you want to do it. Maybe putting up that photo to begin with is too painful, so you keep it somewhere safe. Maybe it's just on your phone in an album that's locked, and then gradually you allow yourself to open that album. So there's lots of different ways that you can sort of engage with that memory work, isn't there?
Yeah.
Love that. That's amazing. And, you know, we've talked a lot already about this idea of talking to others and really encouraging us to just find those safe people we can reach out to a bit more. And Callie, again, you even mentioned just more generally, like, how do we begin to have those conversations in more of a social atmosphere and actually just remembering in the middle of conversations? And so we do just want to, you know, really just quickly say again, like, it is so important if we can find those people to speak to. And actually, we really encourage that those conversations are allowed and they're okay, and they're probably really good for us as well. And they're probably really good for the people around us that are maybe feeling similar feelings, but have just not mentioned it to us. And we talk a lot in Headstrong and Illumina, and I'm sure you guys do as well, about this idea of bottling it up. And actually, when those feelings sit inside of us, they can just become really overwhelming, and they can be really difficult to get out the more they just build. And so we absolutely would just say, like, it's okay to feel these feelings, and it's really good if we can talk about it and begin to let out some of that. So yeah, thank you. There was one more thing you guys mentioned that I thought was an amazing thing, and it was this quote about meaning making. That coping with loss requires us to reconstruct a world that makes sense, that resembles a sense of meaning. And, you know, that quote might sound really crazy or out there to some people watching right now. So could you just give us a bit of an idea of what this looks like, what this might mean for us in our lives?
I think so often when something is taken from us or we lose something, in whatever sense of the word we're talking about it today, what we lose is our sense of what is normal, our sense of our world. And people describe having their world shaken, having things taken from under them. There's all these analogies we use. But what we're really talking about there is a sense of security and a sense of meaning and what our place is within that meaning. When we're managing a loss, when we're trying to navigate that new world, we're navigating a new normal. It's a phrase that was used quite a lot in the pandemic period, this new normal. But it's that human need, really, for a sense of routine and a sense of things that make sense. Rationalize something that gives you a sense of why you're where you are and what you should be doing within it. And as soon as we've sort of accepted how we feel, found a way to make those memories, we can make some meaning from it. We hear people, talking about what their loved one might have wanted for them in the future. And there's a lot of expectation sometimes weighed with that. But you can also decide that yourself. You have the freedom now to make sense of it in whatever way works for you. And some people go on to do something and memorialise them in maybe a really public way, perhaps running a marathon, becoming an ambassador for a grief organisation. We see young people doing things like that all the time. And some people choose to do it in a much more personal way. And both ways are meaning making.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a real focus there on identity, isn't there? And as you said, when we're embarking on a new normal, we can sometimes question who am I? What do I like anymore? What do I not like now? And if that person, is incredibly significant and that loss is so significant because of that, even practically we can question our identity. If we're thinking there about the loss of a sibling, for example, are we now the oldest? Because we used to be the middle child. Am I now taking on that role? There's a lot around really navigating our way through our own identities when we've suffered such a loss. So again, it's all the things that Callie mentioned, giving that time to really make sense of what has happened, of make sense of who you are, because you are the same person. It may just look and feel really different for a period of time. But again, we can't emphasize enough the importance of putting those feelings somewhere and making sure, as Robson said, not holding them in. Because what we do know, especially with the anger that we touched on earlier on, is that doing that long term, it's going to come out. It needs to come out, and more often than not, if we don't do that gradually, it may come out in a really difficult, unhealthy way. So sharing feelings long term is far more beneficial.
I love that. Yeah, and that point of taking time to grieve is absolutely maybe one of the big things we just wanted to end this on, was that we wanted to come back to this idea of looking after ourselves and actually giving ourselves that time. And that might mean that for a while we mainly just focus on what can we do to look after ourselves right now, and we're just allowing ourselves to process those feelings, because as we said right back at the start, those feelings, it might be quite normal that they pop up for us. It might be inevitable that at some point they're going to pop up for us. And actually, therefore, it's okay for us to just work through them at the pace we need to. And so we want to suggest that we can do things like journaling or art or music, like we mentioned earlier, or even just as simple as our self-care and our sleep habits. Like, we're really just focusing in on what things help us feel okay around these feelings. And that can help us begin to work through them and begin to take time to process them. And then again, that talking, that idea of just talking and maybe soothing for ourselves during that time are some big final points we wanted to make. And so on this idea of maybe self-care and looking after ourselves, we wanted to end this session thinking about that exact same idea, because we felt like this space might be quite heavy for some people. We might have brought up some things that we've not really wanted to think about or even know we were going to think about before. And so we wanted to end these sessions by just really encouraging you to take that self-care time now, to do something small or something that you're able to do, in this moment, or just after this video ends, just to look after yourself. And just encourage you that that's a way you can do that you can practice it, so that you can become more confident to do that when you do feel feelings of loss or when feelings of grief pop up, that you're already confident to do it. And I don't know about you guys, but I am terrible at, like, once I feel maybe a bit difficult feeling, or feel quite low, or feel overwhelmed, I'm terrible at doing self-care. I'm terrible at, like, being able to kickstart it and get myself up. But one massive trick that I've found that does help is that sometimes I let fate decide what I'm going to do. I, like, flip a coin, or I roll a dice, or I found this amazing little tool here that allows you to spin a wheel, and it randomizes and just tells you what to do instead. And I found that that can be such an easier way, because it takes the responsibility off us a bit, doesn't it? It says, like, I can't decide that right now. I've got too much going on in my head, and that's okay. I'm going to let the wheel decide. And so we've got this wheel that's full of different things, like taking a walk, like maybe doing some reading that we enjoy, or watching our favorite show, or just doing something good for ourselves, like just a bit of skincare, just to look after ourselves for a moment. And we'd really encourage you to just spin that wheel and see what it tells you to do this evening, and see if you're able to do that for 5 minutes, just as a way to relax. Yeah, do you guys have any final thoughts on any of that?
I think it's just helpful to do it, and it's certainly something we'd advocate doing ourselves too. You know, we're transitioning out of a really difficult topic, as you said, when we have an ending, when we're talking about endings in itself is difficult. So having something that you can then move into that feels like self-care, that feels like not an additional choice to make, a decision to make, something that can also then make you realize what you really want to do, because it might end on something that you think, oh, I'm not doing that. Well, that's helped you make a decision, and in itself that's really powerful. So have that. I think that's a really lovely way to end our time chatting with you today.
Well, it's been amazing, and we've loved this conversation, or I've loved it. I'm sure everyone else watching has, and it's been so insightful, just to give us more of an idea of what this idea of loss and grief is. And on that topic of all the different feelings that we brought up, we'd really encourage you to check out the other live streams that are available around some of those different feelings if we need to, but also to feel free to watch through this again. And of course, we'd also really encourage you to just check out what me and Maya are also saying about this, what me and my therapy have to say around these topics, or what resources and tools they're creating. Because you guys have touched on so many great things of memories, of, like, processing, of meaning making. And that's, I know for a fact, that's some of the work you guys do. So we'd really encourage that as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Sarah and Callie, so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Guys.
Yeah, it's been brilliant. And we hope you take care. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.